Hey everyone, I'm Sophie. I'm an alcoholic and really grateful to be here today and have the opportunity to create safer spaces in Alcoholics Anonymous. So I'm going to be sharing my screen in a moment, but just wanted you to note that my monitor is down below, so I'm going to be looking there at my notes as well. All right. We are going to be going over today a worksheet that my coworker and I created to work white supremacy through the fourth step. Racism and white supremacy are societal issues that we are all affected by. We use a 12-step model in AA to treat our disease of alcoholism, and similarly, we can apply this same solution to white supremacy. Through our fourth step inventory process, we can acknowledge and work through our racism or internal racism. For example, we can make an honest inventory of how we participate in racist policies and practices. Okay, so some disclaimers and limitations to the presentation and worksheet. This presentation was originally created for an unofficial 12-step group. The purpose of the presentation was for white AA members in the group to work a fourth step on white supremacy. Later on, my coworker and I adapted it for our work. My coworker is a person of color. However, she's not in Alcoholics Anonymous. And a couple BIPOC AA members have reviewed this content. However, much more BIPOC collaboration is needed to mitigate causing potential harm. White AA members, including myself, should be careful about instructing BIPOC folks to examine their internal racism and how to do so. It's possible that this fourth step worksheet, as it's currently written, might not be helpful for BIPOC AA members, and an entirely different worksheet might be better served. This worksheet, finally, is not intended for white sponsors to work on with BIPOC sponsees. If helpful, there are some alternative questions that BIPOC AA members can answer using this worksheet, but more or different questions might be needed. For example, the worksheet contains the question, who have I harmed with my racism? For BIPOC members who feel it would be useful to examine internalized racism, this question could be rephrased to state who was harmed, and self could be the response. When it relates to trauma, and of course racism is trauma, it is sometimes not helpful to fill out the your part section altogether because the only role one had in that situation is existing. Thus, for the question which asks, what have I done to harm the person in the previous column, BIPOC folks might write NA. Another question asks, what anti-racist actions will I take to make amends for my past harm and mitigate future harm? And BIPOC folks could respond with something like advocate for myself, if that's applicable or helpful. After the first presentation, a member asked, how do we bring institutions into this inventory process since white people benefit greatly from our privilege and participation in institutions? Great question. One example from Gail Golden's work, which informed how I have set up this fourth step, could be implemented into the amends/solution question or section. So if we're gatekeepers, for example, if we control access to resources, if we're a hiring manager or college admissions officer, we will work to allocate these resources more equitably. A future iteration of the worksheet might include institutions in the format directly. And lastly, I want to take this opportunity to put our anti-racist work into action and asks folks to challenge language that furthers white supremacist thought, including from me. In order to not burden BIPOC members in the space, I'm asking allies to take it upon ourselves to speak up. Thank you all for your participation. All right, so for today's presentation, I'll be going over the worksheet step by step. After the first presentation, I emailed all of the members a copy of the worksheet, these slides. I assigned homework at the end and resources to refer to when completing the worksheet. The homework was to complete individual fourth step inventories. And I gave members a due date to circle back and meet up again for the sharing session where everybody went over their fourth step inventory findings at group level. We've only programmed the presentation for today and not the discussion, but I'm happy to share resources for the discussion portion if people are interested and the group is okay with that via email, etc. In case anyone wants to implement the discussion portion for their own use, I'll discuss a couple disclaimers to try to minimize the amount of potential harm that could come from sharing inventories at group level. If people are interested in hosting a discussion, I would also recommend reviewing my presentation script, my notes for today, essentially, the script for the discussion portion, and emails I sent out to group members after the presentation and prior to the discussion portion. Okay. In AA, one of our aims is to be spiritually fit. And yet, white sponsors and white sponsees typically do not work a fourth step on racism in what is supposed to be a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. As most of us know, BIPOC members have been pointing out the hypocrisy in this for quite some time. As white AA members, it's our responsibility to both acknowledge and work through our racism. This is step 4 revised. It comes from Gail Golden's White Privilege as an Addiction. In this revision of the fourth step, it reads, we make an honest inventory of how we participate in racist policies and practices. The reason I included this is because I have taken from Gail Golden's work in terms of how we've set up the inventory worksheet that we'll be discussing today. And I've also included references at the end. If at any time you feel triggered, I would advise to feel free to turn your camera off and take the time you need to take care of yourself as part of our safe space community agreements. And if we were doing a discussion portion today, we would have the group come up with additional community agreements. Okay, and before going over the worksheet, I wanted to share a couple resources that you can refer to when completing the worksheet. Here are 2 links discussing internalized messages of superiority and inferiority, and I will now read examples of them pulled from the article. Here's internalized messages of white superiority. Entitlement. I have a right, title, claim to this. I deserve what I have. I have the right to define things how I see them and demand that others accept my definition. Intellectualization. Concepts and theories matter. Feelings are inferior to thinking. Normative. My worldview is the universal worldview. Our standards and norms are universal. For example, think about who and how these terms are defined. Good parenting, stable family, well-raised child, individual self-sufficiency, and effective leadership. Fantasy of fragility. When I experience discomfort in the presence of Black, Indigenous people of color, or when matters of race come up, I confuse fear with danger and comfort with safety, triggering a fight, flee, or freeze response. Silence. Being silent when racism shows up is neutral, not doing any harm. I will wait until I know exactly what to say before I speak up. And it continues. Colorblindness. I see all people the same. I believe all people are equal. I don't see color. Bias and difference are bad. Talking about racism is racist or an attack on white people. Cognitive dissonance. I'm not responsible for racism that other white people perpetuated in the past, nor do I have to know anything about it. I have a right to be ignorant. Distancing or exceptionalism. Racism is just about a few bad apples. So, a few corrupt police officers, or a few mentally unstable terrorists, or a few self-described white supremacists. Meritocracy. My achievements have to do with me, not with my membership in the white group. I can feel that I personally earned, through work and merit, any or all of my success. I have many choices, as I should. Everyone else has those same choices. Tokenism. I will recruit or engage only a small number of people of color who fit into my worldview or way of doing things to give the appearance of racial equality in this process or organization. Here now is a list of internalized inferiority or racist oppression messages, and not exhaustive again. Carry internalized negative messages about ourselves and other people of color. Believe there is something wrong with being a person of color. Have lowered self-esteem, sense of inferiority, wrongness. Have lowered expectations, limited sense of potential for self. Have very limited choices, either act in, white, or act out, disrupt. Have a sense of limited possibility, limited by oppression and prejudice, cycles through generations. Oh, before we get into this handout, you'll see here, I wanted to let you all know that the internalized message we're using today in our example is don't rock the boat. Okay, back to the handout. I will show you a larger version you can read fully in the next slides. But as you can see, I pulled out an example of white supremacy characteristic that we're going to be talking about, and that's fear of open conflict. The description of that, and all of these have descriptions underneath the characteristics, states people in power try to ignore or run from conflict. When someone raises an issue, the response is to blame that person rather than to look at the issue. Emphasis on being polite, so raising difficult issues as being impolite, rude, or out of line. Then they go over antidotes for these racist characteristics. Antidotes could also be seen as solution or amends, and we're going to talk more about that in another column. But this example says role play ways to handle conflict before it happens, distinguish between politeness and raising hard issues. Once a conflict is resolved, reflect on how it was resolved and or might have been handled differently. Okay, we are going to read all of these characteristics of white supremacy culture. And if anyone was here with me, I would have other folks read. But you have to listen to my voice a lot today. Apologies. All right. Perfectionism. Little appreciation expressed for others' work. Criticism more common. Criticism of person or their work in their absence, even more common. Mistakes seen as personal failings. Antidotes. Develop a culture of appreciation. Develop a learning organization where it's expected that everyone makes mistakes and those mistakes offer opportunities for learning. Sense of urgency. Continued sense of little time that undermines inclusivity and or democratic and thoughtful decision making. This sacrifices potential allies in favor of quick or highly visible results, reinforced by funding proposals that promise and funders that expect too much for too little, realistic work plans, leadership that understands that things take longer than anyone expects, discuss and plans for what it means to set goals of inclusivity and diversity, particularly in terms of time. And it goes on a little bit more. Defensiveness. Organization and energy focused on preventing abuse and protecting those in power. Criticism of those with power viewed as inappropriate. Difficult to raise new or challenging ideas. Energy devoted to avoiding hurt feelings and working around defensive people. Antidotes. Understand how defensiveness is linked to fear or losing power, face, comfort, privilege. Name defensiveness as a problem when it is one. Quantity over quality. Measurable things are most valued. Little value attached to process. Discomfort with emotions and feelings. Antidotes. Include process goals and planning. Develop a value statement about how work will be done in the organization. Develop methods for measuring process. Recognize when you need to get off the agenda to address people's feelings and underlying concerns. Worship of the written word. Those with strong documentation and writing skills are more highly valued, even in orgs where ability to relate to others is key. The org doesn't value other ways in which information gets shared. Antidotes. Analyze other ways people get and share information, come up with alternative ways to document what is happening. Work to recognize the contributions and skills that every person brings to the organization. Make sure anything written can be clearly understood, and it goes on a little more. Only one right way. Belief there is only one right way to do things and that people will learn and adopt it. When they do not, then something is wrong with them. Antidotes. Accept that there are many ways to get to the same goal. Notice and name behavior when folks or groups push one right way. Acknowledge you have a lot to learn from community partners' way of doing. Be willing to adapt. Never assume you or the organization knows what's best, and it goes on. Paternalism. Decision making clear to those with power, unclear to those without it. Those with power feel capable of making decisions for and in the interests of those without power. Those with power don't view as important or necessary understanding the views or experience of those with whom they decide, for whom they decide. Antidotes. Ensure transparency about decision making. Include people affected by decisions in the process. Either or thinking. Things are either or, good or bad, right or wrong, with us or against us. No sense that things can be both and. Results in oversimplifying complex things. Increases sense of urgency that we must do this or that without time to consider a middle way. Antidotes. When people use either or language, push for more than two alternatives. When people simplify complex issues, encourage deeper analysis. With urgent decisions, make sure people have time to think creatively. Power hoarding. Little value around sharing power. Those with power feel threatened when change is suggested and experience this as a judgment of them. They also assume they have everyone's best interests at heart and that those wanting change are ill-informed, emotional, or inexperienced. Antidotes. Include power sharing in your org's value statement. Discuss that good leaders develop the power and skills of others. Understand that change is inevitable and that challenges to leadership can be productive and healthy. Fear of open conflict. People in power try to ignore or run from conflict. I won't read all of this because this is the example we're using, so I'll just read one more. When someone raises an issue, response is to blame that person rather than to look at the issue. Okay, close out with individualism, and I'm the only one. Little experience or comfort working as part of a team. People feel responsible for solving problems alone. Accountability goes up and down, not sideways to peers or those whom the organization serves. Desire for individual recognition and credit. Competition valued over collaboration. Antidotes. Include teamwork in your org value statement. Make sure that credit is given to all those who participate in an effort, not just the leaders. Practice group, not individual accountability. Use meetings to solve problems, not just report activities. And I'm the only one. Connected to individualism, the belief that if something is going to get done right, I have to do it. Little or no ability to delegate work to others. Antidote. Evaluate people based on their ability to delegate to others. Evaluate people based on their ability to work as part of a team to accomplish shared goals. Now I will go over each column in the worksheet individually. This is what the worksheet looks like, and I'll show it again afterwards. These can be changed and adapted, and this is just a demonstration of what it would look like for me since that's the experience that I have with it. So for column 1, I'm posing the question here of what racist message have I internalized? This is where you can draw from the examples in the links to the articles I mentioned about internalized messages. Again, the example I provided for column 1 was don't rock the boat. Column 2 takes from that and asks, what specific thought patterns have I relied on to rationalize the message in column 1? These include, if I rock the boat, people will be upset with me. It's wrong to question those in power. If I challenge authority, there will be backlash. The people in power deserve all their power. Don't make those in power uncomfortable. Column 2 is gray in this slide because we already talked about it, but it relates directly to column 3. So I wanted you all to be able to compare them visually. In column 3, the question posed is, what characteristics of white supremacy culture are evident in column 2? The bullet points in column 2 and 3 correspond with one another. For example, the bullet point from column 2, if I rock the boat, people will be upset with me, correlates to the fear of open conflict, which we talked about in the handout example. That description might be emphasis on being polite, so raising difficult issues as being impolite, rude, or out of line. And just know that since the descriptions are in the handout, it's not necessarily required to write out what's in the parentheses, the descriptions, but if that is helpful, feel free to do so. Other characteristics include defensiveness, the criticism of those with power viewed as inappropriate. Power hoarding, those with power feel threatened when change is suggested. The right to comfort. Belief that those with power have a right to emotional and psychological comfort. Okay. So we then move to slide that talks about column 4. And it asks, who have I harmed with my racism? The example below states the person harmed is a classmate who is a person of color. So to reiterate from kind of the disclaimers in the beginning, if BIPOC folks feel column 4 is helpful to do at all, the question could be restated to ask who was harmed rather than who have I harmed, and one can put down self to answer that question. Okay. As you'll note, we're not using specific names in column 4, and here's why. As you can see at the bottom, it says, please note for column 4, when sharing, please avoid names of specific people harmed and instead use general descriptors. For example, my friend. So for the please note, this relates to when we're sharing at group level. For example, instead of saying a specific person's name, you could say my friend or my colleague. You can be specific in your personal inventories, but when sharing, we want to omit specific content because it could be harmful to share publicly. Then for column 5, it asks, what have I done to harm the person or persons listed in column 4? The example here is when a popular white classmate told a racist joke, I did not speak up, perpetuating white solidarity and enabling those with social influence. Then the disclaimer below states for column 5, when sharing at group level, please do not elaborate on specific racist stereotypes, jokes, or words. Instead, say a racist stereotype or joke or word, whatever applies here, was used. Do not repeat the specific content. Again, you can be specific in your inventories, but when sharing, we want to omit specific content because it's harmful as it furthers racist stereotypes and calls out specific racial groups. The behavior still gets conveyed if it's in general terms without being harmful by using those specifics. Noting again here that when it relates to trauma, and of course, racism is trauma, it is sometimes not helpful to fill out the your part section altogether because the only role one had in that situation was existing. Therefore, for column 5, what have I done to harm the person in column 4? BIPOC folks might write NA if that's helpful. For column 6, we're asking what anti-racist actions will I take to make amends for my past harm and mitigate future harm? These might include solution or amends option for BIPOC members, if applicable, could be advocate for myself. Calling out racism disguised as humor and doing so in the moment. Role play ways to handle conflicts before it happens, so as white people, we don't freeze in real time. Call out those with power when they defend their power. Understand that being uncomfortable is at the root of all growth and learning. Try not to take everything so personally. Understand that change is inevitable and that challenges to leadership can and often are productive and healthy. And for column 6, one can draw on antidotes from the handout on characteristics of white supremacy that we went over. All right, here's the worksheet again. It contains some of those column disclaimer notes that we just talked about. And as you can see, the worksheet is broken up into categories on the left. So shout out to my brilliant coworker for this adaptation. For example, it says, where do these patterns take place in my personal life, in my community, and in my work? AA could fall under in my community, or else it could be its own category. Okay, this 4th step is not set in stone, and the format can be adapted. After the first presentation, a couple members suggested changing the order to begin with the person harmed, then filling out how they were harmed, followed by the characteristics of white supremacy culture, the internalized message, the specific thought patterns used to justify the internalized message, and finally, amends. I think it might be more intuitive to begin with the person and how they were harmed, as well as switch the order of the internalized message and thought patterns with the characteristics, because it could be easier to extrapolate the internalized message slash thought patterns from the characteristics. So characteristics before the internalized message and thought patterns instead of after, as it currently is. All right, and I wanted to read you all 2 more 4th step inventory examples to really kind of hammer in the format, which again can be changed. So first inventory, what racist message have I internalized? I'm a good white person. What specific thought patterns have I relied on to rationalize the message in column 1? White people are either good, not racist, or bad, racist. I'm not a good person if I'm racist. If I admit the full extent of my racism, my friend will be upset with me. I have a right to be uncomfortable. I'm not willing to hear how others have been harmed by my actions. My character should not be put into question. What characteristics of white supremacy culture are evident in column 2? Either or thinking, fear of open conflict, right to comfort, and defensiveness. Who have I harmed with my racism? My friend. What have I done to harm the person in column 4? When my friend showed me a letter from our childhood where I used a racist word, I became uncomfortable and defensive, taking responsibility only for the letter and trying to minimize my general behavior in order to avoid conflict and preserve my self-schema as a good white person. What anti-racist actions will I take to make amends for my past harm and mitigate future harm? Once a conflict is resolved, reflect on how it was resolved and or might have been handled differently. Don't minimize harm I've caused because my comfort as a white person maintains systems of oppression, continues white supremacist power dynamics, and keeps me from making progress with anti-racism. It doesn't matter that my intentions weren't to harm because the impact caused harm. Understand how defensiveness is linked to fear of losing power, face, comfort, privilege. Name defensiveness as a problem when it is one. Take responsibility for white fragility in real time. Look deeper into the good-bad binary. When I'm not taking anti-racist actions, I'm complicit by default with white supremacy. It's not so simple as good or bad. It's fluid and dependent on behavior. Educate myself and other white people and take responsibility for my actions. Make amends for past injustices. So living amends, which could include financial reparations. In second inventory, what racist message have I internalized? It's okay for me to engage in cultural appropriation because my friends are people of color. What specific thought patterns have I relied on to rationalize the message in column 1? I'm not responsible for what happened before, nor do I have to know anything about it. Cognitive dissonance. I have a right to be ignorant. I can engage in cultural appropriation in order to seem cool. My intentions aren't to cause harm. Can be specific here about the ways in which one engaged in cultural appropriation in your personal inventory, but be general when sharing at group level. I'm not racist. I'm a good white person. What characteristics of white supremacy culture are evident in column 2? Right to comfort, defensiveness, either or thinking. Who have I harmed with my racism? My BIPOC friends and the BIPOC community. What have I done to harm the person in column 4? I participated in harmful cultural appropriation, so giving examples in my personal inventory, but omitting sharing specifics at group level, without learning about or acknowledging the history of the community or giving back in any way in order to fit in and for social status. What anti-racist actions will I take to make amends for my past harm and mitigate future harm? Call out harm I've caused, call in or out others causing harm when engaging in cultural appropriation, refrain from using aspects of someone else's culture for my own gain, negating their struggles in my position of power and privilege, which allows society to deem these cultural aspects positively when they're often criticized coming from BIPOC individuals, working on being less self-righteous and entitled, recognize when I'm in the wrong, even if I'm not being called out or receiving social backlash, learning about the specific community affected and culture. All right, we're getting close to the end of the presentation, so just a couple more items to discuss. I want to emphasize that this is our take and everyone's could look different. I hope that it's helpful. I base this off the spirit somewhat of the AA Fourth Step, Gail Golden's work, the handout on characteristics of white supremacy, the articles on racist internalized messages, and also Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I highly recommend. As we wrap up, I'd like to provide a little more history about past discussions. In the first presentation, we had a discussion portion with breakout rooms. White folks who had not completed the worksheet were asked to listen and only share at the end if there was time. We had 2 to 3 people in each room, and there was an option for BIPOC folks to not go into a breakout room or breakout rooms and instead stay in the main room to discuss the worksheet or have a conversation or whatever would be helpful. The reasoning for this was to try to minimize harm to BIPOC folks if listening to white people in the breakout rooms, for instance, working out their racism was triggering or re-traumatizing. There was also an option to return to the main session from one of the breakout rooms at any time. BIPOC members were also given the option to email me ahead of time if they knew they would prefer the BIPOC-only breakout room. I reminded folks at the beginning of the discussion section to omit specific racist content when sharing at group level to try to mitigate some of that potential harm. In the second presentation for my old job, we provided a breakout room that was a safe space for folks who did not want to talk. If they wanted to transition to that breakout room from a different breakout room, they could select the return to the main session feature. My coworker and I were there in the main session for any folks who wanted to be assigned to the safe space breakout room. Attendees could also utilize the Ask for Help Zoom function. Thank you all so much for listening. And here are a bunch of resources to share. The references are on this page, of course, and then also happy to send the links outlining examples of internalized messages to refer to when completing the worksheet, the handout, characteristics of white supremacy culture to refer to when filling out the worksheet, slides from the presentation, which contain worksheet directions and an example, my scripts used for both the presentation and discussion, and emails to group members after the presentation and before the discussion. All right. Really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.